This episode of Mr. Hutchings History is now streaming on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and all your favorite platforms like Castbox, Podcast Addict, and Amazon Music. Tune in now.
Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Hey everyone, ready to go deep on another piece of history?
Always.
Awesome. Today, we're looking at women welders during World War II.
Ooh, interesting.
Yeah, no, right? And get this, we've got Augusta Clawson's actual diary from 1944.
Wow, a first-hand account.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's going to be eye-opening to see what it was really like for these women,
Yeah.
taking on jobs that were usually, considered men's work.
Yeah, you always hear about Rosie the Riveter, but this is like getting past the poster and into the nitty-gritty.
Totally. But before we get too far into Clawson's story, what was going on in America back then that even made this a thing?
Right, so it's 1944. Millions of men are off fighting.
Huge labor shortage.
Exactly, especially in industries that were crucial to the war effort.
So someone's got to build the ships and planes.
Exactly, and by that point you had over 6 million women.
6 million. Wow.
Yeah, it's incredible. They're working in factories, shipyards, all these places that, were traditionally dominated by men.
Talk about a workforce shakeup.
Oh, absolutely. And welding was like the skill to have.
For everything.
Yeah, from the ships I mentioned to airplanes, munitions, you name it.
So, okay, let's get into Clawson's diary. What's she telling us about actually being a woman welder in this whole scene?
Well, one thing that really jumped out at me was how vividly she describes the physical challenges of it all. It wasn't just heavy lifting. It was the positions they had to weld in,
Awkward position.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Like for hours at a time.
Oh, man, I can only imagine welding overhead vertically. That sounds brutal.
It was. And then on top of that, the conditions themselves, right?
Yeah, the working conditions weren't exactly a picnic from what I've read.
Definitely not. Clawson talks about sparks raining down the constant noise of all the machinery, the intense heat.
Yeah, not the most pleasant environment.
Nope. She even compares the noise of the chippers to giant woodpeckers constantly hammering.
Wow, that's a pretty intense image.
And then you add in the heavy protective gear they had to wear.
Ugh, yeah. Gotta stay safe. But that can't have been comfortable in that heat.
No kidding. Especially in those hot, noisy environments. So yeah, not quite the glamorous image we sometimes see in those old posters, right?
You're not even close.
Yeah.
So it sounds like it was physically grueling, but you were saying earlier that Clawson actually felt the mental strain was even worse.
Yeah, that's what's really interesting. She talks about this constant sense of inadequacy, she wasn't taken seriously because she was a woman.
Ugh, that's rough.
It was. She mentions the lack of proper training and that there were just low expectations placed on women's abilities in general.
Like they were almost set up to fail from the get-go.
In a way, yeah. She writes about this immense pressure to prove herself. Not just for her own sake, but for all women working in these roles.
Man, that's a heavy load to carry on top of everything else.
It really is. It speaks volumes about the resilience of these women. But, despite all that, Clawson's diary also shows this growing sense of pride and accomplishment as her skills developed.
So, mastering the craft itself became a source of empowerment.
Exactly. There's this one moment she talks about where she finally feels confident in her ability to tack.
Okay, so for those of us who aren't welders, what exactly a guy-ass tacking, and why was this such a big deal for Clawson?
Oh, right, sure. So tacking is like a fundamental welding technique. It's where you make these small welds to hold pieces of metal together before you do the full weld.
Kind of like a temporary support structure.
Yeah, exactly, like building a little scaffolding.
Yeah.
And it takes a lot of precision, a steady hand.
So for Clawson, it wasn't just about learning a skill, it was about proving she could handle it in this male-dominated world.
Exactly. And that's where her story starts to challenge those typical narratives about women during World War II. It wasn't just a story about patriotic duty or filling in while the men were away. It was about women stepping into these roles and truly excelling, even with all the obstacles.
Yeah, I'm definitely seeing a turning point in her story here. It's like she goes from feeling inadequate to feeling empowered by her skills.
You got it. And that shift is really important because it reflects this bigger idea that emerges in her diary, which is the transformative power of work.
Yeah, it's really inspiring how she found that strength through her work.
Yeah.
Especially in such a tough environment.
It really shows just how complicated their experience was, right? These women weren't just filling a gap. They were individuals finding meaning in what they were doing, contributing to the war effort.
Yeah, makes you think what was going through their minds as they were welding those ships and planes, knowing their work was going straight to the front lines.
Absolutely. That connection to something bigger than themselves must have been powerful. Clawson even mentions this feeling of camaraderie with the other women welders. Like they were all in it together, you know?
Yeah, that sense of community probably helped them through those long days and tough conditions.
I'm sure it did. But we also have to remember that not every woman had a positive experience during this time. Some thrived in these new roles, but others dealt with discrimination, harassment, unfair pay.
Right, the Clawson story is just one perspective. It doesn't represent the full picture of what all women went through in these wartime industries.
Exactly, which is why it's so interesting to see how different historians have interpreted this whole period. They offer all these different angles that help us understand how complicated it really was.
Okay, so I'm really curious about these different historical views. Can you give us a quick rundown of some of the main interpretations?
Sure, so one school of thought, often called traditionalist history, they tend to focus on the patriotic side of things. You know how women stepped up to support their country, filling those vital roles, keeping things going on the home front?
Makes sense. It was a time when everyone was coming together for the common good.
Right. Then you have feminist historians who see it differently. They view this time as a turning point in the fight for gender equality. They argue that women's work during the war challenged those old gender roles and paved the way for later feminist movements.
So they're looking at the long-term effects on women's rights and opportunities.
Exactly. They see this as a time when women proved they could handle these jobs that were always seen as men's work. It helped break down those societal expectations.
That's fascinating. It sounds like they're highlighting how this experience really changed things for women, both individually and as a whole.
For sure. And then you have revisionist historians. They take a more critical look. They acknowledge that women contributed, but they point out that a lot of them lost those jobs when the men came back from war.
So they're saying the war didn't magically fix the problem of gender discrimination.
Right. They argue that while the war opened doors for women, those opportunities were often temporary and tied to the war effort.
That's a good point. It reminds us that progress isn't always straightforward. There can be steps forward and then steps back.
Absolutely.
Huh.
And then there's the Marxist historians who view this through an economic lens. They focus on the capitalist system, arguing that women were brought in because they were cheap labor, not because anyone truly wanted equality.
So basically they're saying women were seen as a reserve workforce, important during the war but disposable after.
Yeah, that's a key part of their argument. They'd probably point to the fact that women were often paid less than men for the same work and rarely given chances to move up.
It's amazing how one event can be viewed in so many ways. Each perspective adds a different piece to the story.
It really is. And it's important to consider all these viewpoints when we're trying to understand how complex women's roles were during World War II.
So Clawson's story fits right into this bigger historical debate.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And while her diary doesn't directly talk about these different historical interpretations, it gives us this really personal look into what life was actually like for women working in those wartime industries.
And that's what makes it so valuable. It brings those historical trends to life and helps us connect with the real people who lived through it all.
For sure. And it makes you wonder, how did all of this shape their lives down the road?
Yeah, that's a question that sticks with you after reading Clawson's diary. What happened to these women after the war ended? Did they go back to more traditional roles, or did they keep pushing against those societal expectations?
That's something historians are still looking into. While a lot of women were forced out of those industrial jobs, what they went through definitely had a lasting effect.
Yeah, it's like even if it was temporary for a lot of them, it opened their eyes to what was possible.
Exactly. And, the fight for equality, it's not always a straight line.
No, for sure. There are always going to be those setbacks and detours.
Absolutely. But even those setbacks, they can teach us something, right? They can fuel those future movements and inspire new generations to keep fighting.
For sure. And when you look at what happened after World War II, you see those changes happening. The Equal Pay Act in '63, the rise of second-wave feminism in the '60s and '70s. All those movements were driven in part by women who had experienced something different during the war. They saw that their contributions mattered, that they were capable. It's like that wartime experience planted a seed, even if it was temporary for some, and then later on it blossomed into these whole movements for social change.
That's a great way to put it. And it brings us back to Augusta Clawson and how these personal stories can help us understand those bigger historical shifts.
Absolutely. Her diary gives us such an intimate look at what life was truly like for those women working in those shipyards and factories.
It really does. And it makes you wonder, what about her life after the war? Did she hold on to that sense of accomplishment? Did she keep pushing boundaries? Or was she pressured to go back to a more traditional role?
Yeah, the sources we have focus on the wartime experience, but they leave you wanting to know more about what came next. Did she keep welding? Did she teach those skills to other women? Did she become a mentor?
Those are all great questions, and unfortunately, we just don't have those answers from what we've got here. But that's part of what makes history so interesting, isn't it? There are always more stories waiting to be discovered, more perspectives to consider.
And even those unanswered questions, they can spark our curiosity and make us want to learn more.
Exactly. History isn't just a bunch of facts in a book. It's a conversation that's always going on, a process of discovery and looking at things in new ways.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Augusta Clawson's world and the role of women in wartime industries, what's the one big thing you hope our listeners take away from all of this?
I think the most important thing to remember is that history is made by individuals like Augusta Clawson who challenged the norms, stepped outside their comfort zones, and by doing that, they helped shape the world we live in today. Their stories show us that progress often starts with those small acts of courage and determination.
Well said. And I think it's also a reminder that we all have a part to play in carrying that progress forward, whether it's challenging gender stereotypes in our own lives, supporting groups that fight for equality, or just being aware of the biases that still exist. We can all contribute to a more just and equitable world.
Absolutely. And one of the best ways to do that is by seeking out and sharing those untold stories. The stories of people who might not be in the history books, but whose experiences still had an impact on how things turned out.
That's a great point. Each of those individual stories adds another layer to our understanding of the past and helps us connect with those who came before us.
And in the end, I think that's what makes history so relevant to our lives today. It's not just about memorizing dates and names. It's about understanding the human experience in all its complexity and finding inspiration from those who fought for a better world.
So to all our listeners out there, keep exploring those stories. Keep asking questions and keep pushing for a future where everyone has the chance to reach their full potential.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into a really fascinating and often overlooked part of World War II history. We'll see you next time for another deep dive into a brand new topic.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.